Hey everybody, Big Buckarama back again with a quick little impromptu review video. This video is kind of a semi-custom review, if you will, based on a post that was made on r/IEMs on Reddit of an individual who was asking about a comparison between the Kiwi Ears Airoso, the Aether, and the Simgot Supermix4. Given that all three of these are in the $100 to $150 price category, I think it's a pretty fair comparison. And unfortunately, most of the people that were commenting on his post did not have all three of these sets, or even a combination of two of them in some cases. So I wanted to give a proper balanced review of all three of these sets to hopefully give him a little bit better of a idea of what to pick. Now, in terms of these three sets, as of the recording of this in the 16th of October in 2025, the Kiwi Ears Airoso is currently on sale on the Linsole store on Amazon with like a 30 to 35% off coupon. I forget what the exact percentage is, but it basically brings the price of these down to $85. And for $85, that is a lot of audio quality for $85. I think the only thing that really comes close to competing with that price point in terms of quality for musicality and gaming is basically the Kafine Delchi AE. And in some ways, I think this can be a little bit better than that. Both the Kiwi Ears and the Supermix4 do occasionally go on sale. I think the Aether more so than the Supermix. Obviously, the Supermix is very, very popular, so why would you put something on sale that still sells itself? But I think the biggest thing to realize here is that no matter which one of these three sets you pick, you're not having a dud. You're not getting a bad set. I think that all three of these are perfectly viable for general use. In the case of this user, he mentioned that he mostly was going to be connecting it to his PC and was primarily going to be using this for just general music listening, general video watching, and some gaming. I think Sid mentioned Counter-Strike 2. One thing he also did mention is that he had a TRN Black Pearl dongle DAC that he was going to use with it. It's obviously a Fozzy DS2, but you get the point. And if you're going to use these on a PC, I highly recommend getting a dongle DAC, not for any quality issues or for anything like that, but primarily because, especially in the case of the Airoso and of the Supermix4, both of these sets have passive crossovers in them. And as a result of that, if you have a high impedance source, this will greatly augment the tuning inside the crossover, and in the case of the Supermix4, it'll crank the bass up and really kind of push the upper mids, and in the case of the Airoso, it'll crank the bass up and roll off the treble like crazy. So both of these will sound absolutely ridiculous if you plug them into a high impedance source. Not so much the case with the Aether. The Aether is a single driver, so there is no active crossover, so if you absolutely have no choice but to plug it into a motherboard or a sound output for a laptop or something like that, the Aether will sound exactly the same regardless, because no crossover network. In terms of build quality of all of these, I have absolutely nothing bad to say about any of them. I've never had any issues with durability on any of these. It's nothing like the EM6L where people constantly talk about, breaking the nozzles off on them. It's not like some of the other sets where people talk about clogged nozzles or anything like that. I've never had any issues with this. In terms of build quality, the Supermix4 and the Aether are both pretty similar. They both have a 3D printed resin shell and then have a aluminum top cap on both of them. The Airoso, as you can see, its top cap is fairly thick and chunky and pretty bland and kind of plain looking. The Supermix4 has a kind of a gunmetal gray with this kind of gold ringlet in it with a little bit of venting in the center there. This is more of a cap, as this is kind of like almost like a flat piece of aluminum just glued in there. This is more of a machined out cap. So I think, these are probably more durable than these, but I mean, we're splitting hairs here. The Airoso is predominantly, or excuse me, the Aether is predominantly a 3D printed resin shell, and basically this aluminum here is just kind of around the outside edge, and there's this custom resin cap that is in the middle here. But again, it's still plenty durable. I've never had any issues with anything, falling apart or feeling like it was, going to be damaged in any way. In terms of the unboxing experience, none of these are really particularly amazing. The Airoso, pretty straightforward, your typical IEM box. Supermix4, your typical IEM box. I will criticize the Aether. I don't have the boxes out for these. I don't even have the accessories out for these, which we'll get to next. But the Aether, when it comes packaged, these things are like wedged into foam, and they're extremely hard to get out. So do be careful taking these out of the packaging. I don't know who it was at Linsole / Kiwi Ears et al. That decided that packaging was the way to go. Yeah, it's silvery. Yeah, it kind of has a metallic-y look to it. Yeah, it's kind of cool looking in the presentation, but getting these things out of that packaging was an absolute freaking nightmare. And I hope whoever works at Linsole that came up with that idea has been sent back to shipping or, sweeping floors or something, because that was just dumb. In terms of accessories, both of these are your typical Kiwi Ears accessories. Both of the cables are pretty generic. The stock cable that is on the Airoso is a twisted style cable, pretty standard connector, very boring, typical black 2-pin, semi-flush. It's really not a great quality cable. It's serviceable, but I wouldn't brag about it too much. The cable on the Kiwi Ears is a little bit better. The Aether, excuse me. They're both Kiwi Ears. Is a little bit better. It's kind of the traditional higher end cable from Kiwi Ears. It's the braided 4-pin style with their kind of hourglass shaped connector on the conductor. It's reasonable quality. It's decent. Both of those cables have pretty bad memory on them. As you can see, I've upgraded them because I prefer to run 4.4, not for any reason other than I just prefer the duty cycle of these connectors compared to 3.5. I think they're a little bit more robust. In terms of the Supermix4, I actually have the Supermix4 pouch out. Again, I don't know why. But I think of the 3 sets that are here, this is arguably and easily the nicest cable of the trio. It's a twisted pair cable. As you can see there, all of the pieces of the cable, as far as the plug, the ear tip, the 2-pin connectors, even the Y-split, are all colored the same as the faceplate of the Supermix4. So I think this is easily the best cable. So if you're going to be using a 3.5mm cable, Supermix4 is superior. One thing that is not superior on the Supermix4 are these ear tips. These are the typical Simgot kind of 07 style tip. They're perfectly serviceable tips. There's nothing wrong with them. A lot of people prefer these because they're very neutral sounding, but that's all you get. In terms of the 2 Kiwi Ear sets, you do get 3 sets of ear tips. You get some white and some gray silicone tips that have a slightly different density to them as far as the stiffness of the rubber. The whites are a little bit stiffer than the grays, and from my experience, and then they also come with an 08 style tip, which is a tip that has a light gray color and a red central bore in it that's a little bit stiffer durometer silicone rubber than is typical of something like those 07 style tips for the Supermix or the standard tips. So it will give a little bit deeper fit into the inner ear, kind of help grab onto that a little bit more. So again, they're perfectly serviceable tips. I prefer to tip roll. Obviously, like I said, these are all aftermarket cables. I prefer aftermarket cables. I think it just feel better. There's no sound quality improvement. The 4.4 jack isn't going to change anything. I just prefer the way that they are. I will say that in terms of the Aether, because it is a planar, planars are a bit power hungry. This gentleman mentioned that he had a TRM Black Pearl. So if you do end up going with the Ether, I would recommend getting a 4.4 just because the extra power output, planars will do better with more power. So more power, more better with a planar. In terms of overall musicality, moving on to that with these three sets, I think in terms of fun, the Supermix4 is going to win out in the fun category. It's very, I want to say it's V-shaped, but it's more V-slanted than most of than these two sets are. And as a result of that, you know, V-shapes are fun, boosted sub bass, slightly scooped out mids, and generally fairly good treble extension. It's a fun set. The Airoso is also, I would say, little V-shape-ish, not quite as much as the Supermix4, but fairly similar. The difference in the Supermix4 is that it has a 4BA set on it. There is a little bit of BA timbre there. You kind of got to get the right song to do it, but generally it's fairly well controlled, and it's not super sibilant. In fact, I think sibilance is very well controlled on it. The issue with the Airoso is that the bass response is a little slow. And by that I mean that it's not super tactile, it's not as fast acting, and it does have a tendency to get a little overwhelmed if things get very, very busy. It's still perfectly capable, and in isolation you'd probably never notice between these two sets, but if you're doing back-to-back comparison, you do notice that the bass is a little sloppy on the Airoso comparative to these two. It's still, again, a perfectly fine set. The tuning on this, I think, is very agreeable. Like if you're coming from, like I said, iPods or something that do have like typically a little bit more bloated bass, I think these would actually probably be preferable to some people. But generally, I think these are probably the go-to. In terms of the Ether musicality, well, it's a planar, and so planar, you're going to get a lot of details. You're going to get a lot of that really fast transient speed. It's very articulate. The bass is very tight and very crisp. However, because those transients are very fast, the decay time for certain things is very short. And as a result of that, some bass and some things can come off sounding to some people very dry. And then the difference between the mid bass peak and the sub bass peak on the Airoso is fairly minimal. The sub bass peak is a little higher than mid bass on the Supermix4. It's about level on the Airoso, maybe a little bit higher in terms of the sub bass peak over mid bass. The Ether, the sub bass is below the mid bass peak, and as a result of that, they sound very neutral, and they come off as being a little bit boring. In fact, one of the people in the comment section of your thread mentioned that these do sound a little bit boring. And it's true. They're very neutral, almost to the point of being, well, not really boring, but just unexciting. But a very interesting, strange twist, it's the lack of coloration and the lack of overemphasis of unnecessary details and unnecessary tonalities that actually make these a very competent set. And it's one of those things that the more you listen to this, the more you appreciate its articulate nature, the more you appreciate the detail level, and the more you really appreciate how well it layers and separates audio that these two sets simply cannot. Now, how does that translate to gaming? In terms of gaming, I think the Airoso does very well for gaming. The slightly sloppier bass does have a tendency to come into play where in certain scenarios where there's a lot of explosions or a lot of low frequency information that is being played, it can muddy the details. It can make the details feel a little bit congested, and it can draw away some of the directionality that this can actually produce. In terms of the Supermix4, because the mid bass is a little bit more scooped out, the lower mid bass, it separates that sub bass rumble from some of the higher frequencies and footsteps, things like that. And because this does have an emphasis in the lower, or in the upper mids section, it does even offer that bit more separation from the lower mids. And so this is a very good set in terms of gaming for that reason. It does keep things fairly separated, and it is kind of a good jack of all trades in that sense. The Airoso, on the other hand, is an excellent gaming IEM. The separation of sounds, again, because of that transient speed of that planar, really does allow for sounds to come through. It allows for good imaging. It has good height and detail on it, and it generally presents a very good representation of directionality on there. I don't want to use the term soundstage to describe how these are. Soundstage is extremely subjective. For my ears, I feel like this has a wider soundstage, followed by this, with this being last. But tip rolling this can make this sound a little bit better. But I think the directionality and the separation of sounds is more important in some cases than just how volumetric the space seems. And these ones you can really tell directionality, follow very quickly by these, and these again if when things get really, really hectic. And just a little quick note on soundstage, because I feel like this is something that a lot of people don't understand and a lot of people pass over. And some reviewers even go as far as to ridiculously refer to soundstage as a meme, which I think is just an insult to people's intelligence. You know, a lot of what determines in the real world for your ear how soundstage is perceived and where you get these like volumetric cues from, and directionality and size and height and all that, is largely determined by your outer ear. You know, all those sounds impact your outer ear. They bounce around and they, you know, do all kinds of weird things. They get attenuated, they get emphasized, and when they finally bounce and focus their way into your inner ear, even the shape and size of your inner ear will determine how certain sounds get delayed until they hit your eardrum. And then when it finally goes into your nervous system and your brain processes all of that, it kind of, through time and learning, figures out certain frequencies in certain ways mean things are coming from this direction or that direction, and it processes that into what visual information you've been able to learn over the years to figure out, like, you hear that sound, it's coming from this way. When you put an inner IEM into your inner ear, you are completely bypassing all of the kind of, I call it mechanical signal processing of your outer ear. That doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. And the only thing that is going to then determine that soundstage is going to be your driver tuning, where the peaks and dips and valleys in the tuning of the various drivers exist, and then any additional mixing that is done by the sound engineer in the actual main mix of the game or the music that you're listening to, that maybe has some kind of psychoacoustic added to it in order to give a perception of depth, separation, etc. So mixing is very important, and how your brain perceives it is very important. And one person who may perceive one IEM as having wide soundstage, another person may perceive as having very narrow. And in some cases, there are some IEMs where I listen to it and sounds like they're coming from behind me. You know, they're not even in the soundstage, they're behind me, and I feel like they're like coming out of my back pocket. So, you know, the tuning matters a lot, tips matter a lot, insertion depth in your ear matters a lot. Just don't put too much faith in soundstage, because it's not that it's not real and not a thing, it's just not as big of a it's not something that can be truly quantified. It is very, very individual, and it is very subjective. So take any speak about soundstage with a complete and total grain of salt. With all that being said, let's look at some graphs, and let's talk about how these graphs go to how these sound. Now, graphs here courtesy of our good friend Omar over at the Audio Amigo. And very first thing I want to point out here is, of course, the Supermix4. We can see over here how the Supermix4 has the elevated sub bass much more than either the Airoso or the Aether. We can also see how it has that slightly pulled back lower midsection, which does pull a little bit of that mid bass bleed out of there, which kind of does help keep it from being too congested. You can see we have this really, really nice pinna gain here, and we have this peak that happens at around about 2.75K, about 2750, somewhere around in there. Nice kind of little bit of a W shape up here through the upper mids, and then, you know, kind of a gentle treble that does get a nice little boost there past 10K, which gives a good sense of air, twinklies, sparklies, all that fun stuff. Very good balance in terms of a fun IEM. Let me go ahead and put on the Harman target. Oh, this is the wrong Harman target. I'll use the we'll use Audio Amigo's own target. So you can see his target follows fairly close to Harman. Harman would actually come up a little bit higher here and then kind of trail off a little bit more this way. But yeah, it's very much a Harman target IEM. The Truther Nova is another IEM that comes real close to the same target. Let me actually find that here real quick. Truther Nova. There we are. And there's the Truther Nova. And you can see the Truther Nova is very, very close to the Supermix4 in terms of its target. They're both very much Harman target IEMs. You can see that the Nova puts a little bit more emphasis up here around 8K. So it's a little bit more neutral tonally through here. And of course, it doesn't have as much past 10K, so it doesn't sound as sparkly, but it's still very neutral sounding. It has a really, really clean sound to it. So if you find the Supermix to be a little too treble emphasized, the Nova is a fantastic alternative, and it's relatively in the same price as the Supermix4. Slightly chunkier shell, but it is also a good alternative if you're not keen on that. In terms of the Airoso here, comparing it to the Supermix4, you can see we do have, again, a little bit more mid-bass through here. The pinna gain's a little bit shallower, but, you know, generally the treble is very well controlled, and it actually, you know, comes down pretty good. Now, one thing that I will say is interesting, it's not a one-to-one match, but I do want to show you, like, one of the really big, obviously, popular gaming IEMs is the Mangrid T Pro. And now, I'm not in any way comparing the Airoso to the Mangrid. The Mangrid the T Pro is superior in almost every way, but do notice that, you know, there's a lot of similarities here in the way that the peaks come up, the valley it's at, you know, between 5 and 6K to kind of get rid of some of that sibilance, the dip at 10K, the slight peak up, and the way it falls off from here. You know, the Airoso is still a very solid gaming IEM. A lot of people like the T Pro. Now, granted, the quality of the drivers in the T Pro and the tuning on it is vastly superior to what is on the Airoso, but there's a lot of the kind of very similar DNA in how these are tuned. So the Airoso still works very well as a gaming IEM. The only problem is just that the bass and the sub bass, they're just a little slow, and explosions will cloud and will clutter your gaming experience. And in terms of the Aether, when we look at it here, again, you can see compared to the Airoso, it's very, very similar, but it does have that slightly lower sub bass peak. It does have a little bit more here in the pinna gain section, so you're going to get a little bit of extra detail in some of those upper mids through there. It doesn't quite come up nearly as high as the Airoso, but this little dip through here, this is very common of a lot of planars. You see this on almost every single one. It has this little dip here between 2.5 and 6K. This can kind of lead to some little bit of what they call the planar shimmer, and then of course we have this big 8K peak, and you'll see peaks kind of in these areas on planars fairly regularly. You know, even if we look at something like the I'll come up here to the 7 Hertz Timeless 2, and again you can see peak. Timeless 2 is also another good alternative to the Airoso if you're interested in wanting that planar sound, but this is very indicative of planar timbre. This 8K peak here is very real. If you're sensitive to that 8K area, this will bother you. It's not a problem for me, and I think it blends in fairly well and adds a good enough amount of detail. And the rest of the treble is fairly non-offensive beyond that. Again, this is a very neutral-ish tuning. It feels fairly neutral other than this, you know, 8K peak. And as a lot of people say, it is kind of boring, but it does play very detailed. It has good technicalities. It has very, very good imaging and very good separation of audio, sound, and cues, and is very, very good for gaming. And in fact, if you take the time to look at something like Fresh Review's Wall Hack Guide, he does rate the Airoso very highly due to its detail separation, due to its ability to extract that detail out of sounds and to not overwhelm with too much bloated bass, because again, that bass attack is very quick, it's very agile, and so those explosions don't linger and muddy the rest of the sound that you're seeing there. So hopefully that kind of paints a little bit better picture for you. One other thing that I did want to show here before we get too far along is I wanted to show you what happens if you plug in your Supermix or your Airoso into a high ohm impedance. And thankfully, Omar here is really good at measuring all of his IEMs with an impedance adapter, and I've color coded these in advance. You can really see just how much this dramatically changes it. You can see here how much it just takes the treble of the ether and rolls it completely off, and then you can see how much it takes the bass of the Supermix4 and just sends it into the absolute stratosphere. So yeah, if you're going to be using these on a PC, you absolutely want to be using a lower impedance dongle of some kind and not use the onboard high impedance output that's designed for like full-size headphones, because that used to be a thing with gaming for a long time, and that's what the outputs cater to, because it's going to make your IEMs with active crossovers in them sound absolutely like hot garbage. So coming back here to the IEMs again, my personal preference is if you're going to be picking one of these up, it should probably be one of these two. If you want a good fun all-arounder that kind of does everything, I think you can't go wrong with the Supermix. An alternative to the Supermix is going to be the Truthier Nova. It is an all resin shell on the Nova. It's a little bit chunkier than this, but it also doesn't have as much of the semi-custom shell to it. Some people find it more comfortable, some people find it less. The Aether, I think, is for gaming specific, is probably the best of the bunch. And the only thing to keep in mind is that the shell is a bit chunky. It sticks out a little bit wide. That's part of the reason why I have this thinner cable on here, is because it does get a lot of leverage from the cable over the ear, because it is kind of on the outer edge here. So that may be an issue. If you have anything smaller than medium-sized ears, I would not recommend the Aether, but if you want the best gaming IEM of these three, I think the Aether is it, and there are plenty of gaming-specific reviews that do bear that out. The Airoso is not a bad IEM. I still think it's a fantastic IEM. It's fun, it's energetic, it plays a lot of genres well, it does fairly well in gaming. It's just the slower bass response that kind of lets it down in comparison to these two. In itself, in isolation, I think it's a perfectly fine IEM, and for under $100, it is a fantastically good value, and I cannot knock that value. So don't necessarily discredit this one and count it out just because it's maybe not as good as what these two are. For $85, this is a steal. So hopefully that's answered your question. Hopefully that's maybe answered some questions you didn't even know you had, and maybe given you some ideas about some things that you might have not even considered. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed the video. Hope this helps you out. If you have any other questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments. Take care. Bye-bye.